Hi guys, it's Michelle Patterson here with Angel Souls, and I'm about to put up a couple of more Halloween chat videos. One's gonna be on Frankenstein, one's gonna be on vampires. I'm just gonna do this because I was gonna be all formal about it and be like, and this is where Frankenstein comes from. It comes from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Okay, and then I started seeing some parallels between the book Dracula by Bram Stoker and Frankenstein. They're both Gothic novels. Mary Shelley came first for the record. Okay, Bram Stoker's Dracula did not come until 1897. She was all up in 1818. There's a whole story about the night this was written. Dr. Pagliadori actually wrote the Vampire that night, and we're going to talk about it all. But the reason why I'm flipping out a little bit is because there were just so many parallels between the two of them, and it was like, I'm just going to bring my computer over. Hopefully there's no interference. If you hear a slight buzz in the background, it's because my computer is near. I don't know what it is with the GoPro, but it does that. So I might make two separate videos, but that's what's happening. And I'm seriously not messing around. I mean, this is part joke, part not joke. I brought my crossover. I got me some good garlic right here, and I got me some good holy water. You think that's a joke right there? No, that's some holy water. I am not messing. Not today, bad spirits, not today. Anyway, let's get into it. So let's start with Frankenstein. I'm seriously flipped out. Like, I seriously flipped myself out trying to read this stuff. But let's start with the story of Frankenstein. Now, some of you already know that Mary Shelley, I'm kind of obsessed with her, even from a women's history standpoint. She is this incredible daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who is sort of known as, you know, I don't want to call her the mother of feminism, but some people call her the mother of feminism. But she was an incredibly strong woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was married to William Godwin, who was very much into, he's a scientist, and very much into the possibilities. And, you know, he had these high-profile friends. I believe, I should have looked this up, I want to say it was the nephew of Charles Darwin. Shoot, sorry, I should have looked that up. There was just so much, and I sat down, I'm like, I just got to start recording this because there's just so much to, plus I want to keep this kind of concise. But anyway, he had this, Mary Shelley's father had this really big ring of scientifically minded, philosophical minded friends, and they would sit around and talk about, you know, all of these weird concepts. Now, this was during a time when Mary Shelley was growing up. There was a lot of death from, you know, I believe there was a war they just came out of. There was illness, of course. And so the idea of immortality, tying over into the vampire stuff, I done told you, there's all these parallels. Keep note here. You know, this idea of immortality and what can science do to make us live forever. So we have this whole idea of galvanization, so using electricity to animate and the whole bit. So it's a little macabre, not gonna lie, but Mary Shelley grew up around, you know, in this environment, and she grew up listening to these stories. Later on, unfortunately, Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother, died 10 days after Mary Shelley was born. So she grew up only knowing her mother through her mother's writings. Okay, and I think, you know, this is speculation, but, you know, we can probably guess that because she was so obsessed with her mother, she would go and talk to her mother at her graveside, like on a regular basis. She could be found at her mother's graveside. So she probably wanted to follow on her mother's footsteps a little bit. So Mary Shelley kind of became a rebel, right? She runs away. There's a whole big story around this, so I'm just giving you the Cliff's Notes here. But she runs away with Percy Shelley, who's a famous writer at the time. He's friends with Lord Byron, and they go, and I believe they were going to visit Lord Byron. They had to go across this lake. Everything involves a lake, right? Look at some like Eastern European literature, and I think some Russian literature too. More specifically, there's just always a lake. There's always water. But anyway, it was a dark and stormy night. For real, this is like actually what was supposed to be happening. It was supposed to be dark and stormy. They ended up hanging out. Of course, this is like what, like, you know, the early 1800s or something like that. So they had nothing else to do. So they started this whole challenge. Everybody write a ghost story. Now here's another interesting parallel from that evening to vampires, because Lord Byron's personal physician and friend, Dr. Pagliadori, was there that evening as well, and he wrote the first draft of The Vampire. Okay, again, early 1800s, Bram Stoker's Dracula comes not quite 100 years later, maybe like 80 years later or so. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, that there was this original vampire story that was created that same night that Frankenstein was created. So Polidori, it was mistakenly attributed to Lord Byron. Both Lord Byron and Dr. Polidori squashed that, a century ago, saying no, that it was Dr. Polidori's work. So there's that. He's sort of seen as the one who gave birth to vampire stories. So all y'all who are into Twilight or Interview with a Vampire, Anne Rice's work, Bram Stoker's Dracula, it keeps going back even further. so there's that. We'll talk about that in another video. But Mary Shelley, I think she was 18 when she started writing Frankenstein. She was the one who couldn't come up with anything that night. And not to be outdone by these fellas in the other room, she went to sleep and eventually had what she called a waking dream. And it was probably a flood of influences from, again, the stories that she would hear from her father and his friends, and also combined with her experiences with Percy. They had traveled through Germany, and there was Frankenstein Castle. They went by Frankenstein Castle and heard about the man who used to live there, and he would do sort of crazy experiments. So all of this is swirling around her head. She wakes up and she writes a draft of Frankenstein, which we know that as a very iconic symbol in our culture. It's not just Halloween. We'll say, oh, that's a Frankenstein of a word. Okay, nobody else says that. I say that. It's where like somebody messes up two words and they combine them together. So there's that. Anything that's sort of stitched together and has cracks in it, we call it, it's like a Frankenstein of a story, or, it's used all the time in our culture. Now, there's something deeper I want to go into with that whole idea of Frankenstein. Just to be clear, Frankenstein is not the name of the monster. He's just called the monster. He's the creation. He's the fiend. He's called the demon, and all this sort of thing. It's Victor Frankenstein from the story, who is actually, the creator of the monster. Yes? All right, so before I get into that, though, I ended up picking this up. Now, the exact title of the book is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. It's by Mary Shelley, and this version of it, this is by Vintage. I'll just show you the cover here. This is kind of a cool thing to get if you're doing any sort of Gothic literature study, a Mary Shelley study for women's history, or just any kind of literary study. This is incredible because it has Mary Shelley's first draft. How cool is that? P.S. In my research, did I mention this? I did my graduate school thesis on Mary Shelley. I've studied Mary Shelley for years. I've been in libraries where I had to go into a special room and put on white gloves under a special light to look at diaries and stuff like that. So I've done, quite a bit of research, and I think this is a cool version to have if you do any sort of study around this topic. So it has, like I said, her original draft, and then it has what Frankenstein became, and that's why it says Mary Shelley with Percy Shelley, because Percy was already an established writer when she was doing her story, and he helped kind of be the editor of that. The other recommendation I want to make here, you can see I'm a Mary Shelley geek, right? This one, I'm not quite all the way through it. As you can see, I've got my little tag there. Oh, this book is so good, though, if you're into this stuff. It's called Romantic Outlaws, The Extraordinary Lives of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley. So it's Mary Shelley who is, like I said, the author of Frankenstein, and it also talks about her mother. And it's done in this format where we go back and forth between the Marys, which you would think would be confusing, but it's actually not. I mean, it's a little confusing, but if you're paying attention, you can stick with it. And the author, where is it? Why is the author not... Oh, Charlotte Gordon. I knew her last name was Gordon. I just couldn't remember her first name. Charlotte Gordon. Pick this up, guys. It's such a good book. All right. So, Frankenstein. Again, so much in our culture. I think there's even a town, is it in Ohio or is it in Michigan? I think it's called Frankenbooth. A Christmas town, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's like a Christmas themed town called Frankenbooth, so on and so forth. So what is this idea of Frankenstein And what is the real implication behind it? Mary Shelley was like years and years and years ahead of her time. First of all, obviously, if you've ever studied this even in high school, one of the first things everybody talks about with the story of Frankenstein is how man plays God and how we have to be careful with our creations and trying to make things happen on the basis of science, and how science can, because it is thought to be without empathy, right? It's very logistical, it has no emotion behind it. Again, that's the generalized kind of feeling about it. It just shows how it can be a detriment to humanity when used incorrectly or, in the wrong hands, essentially. So we have this story here of Victor Frankenstein. I'm just going to do like the most generic little treatment here, because otherwise we'd be here for hours. There's so much behind this. But Victor Frankenstein, after he's grieving, tries to figure out a way to make a creature come to life. And again, just in the time, just outside of the story, I mentioned that galvanization was this, big kind of like, let's experiment with this. They were doing experiments with frogs and putting copper wires on their legs to see what happens with the muscles and how they twitch, and you read up on it. It's so fascinating. So now we have this idea of, forgive me as I get a little macabre here, but you know the story of Frankenstein, right? There are pieces of, dead bodies stitched together and animated with electricity. So essentially what happens, Victor Frankenstein is, convinced that his creature is going to be the most beautiful creature to ever live, right? It's kind of like our modern day experiments with cloning, even making robots. Even robots, like trying to look how far we can go. It's playing God a little bit. And so Victor Frankenstein is then shocked when his creature starts to come to life and he realizes that it's hideous. And he gets scared of it. He basically runs away, goes and gets his friend. He's like, dude, you got to see this, and comes back, but the creature is gone. The one thing that we don't often talk about, and I've been in quite a few literary circles, nobody ever brings this up. Why does the monster become murderous? Sorry, spoiler alert. He goes off and starts murdering people to get back at his creator, okay? So this monster comes to life. He's rejected by his creator. He goes running off. He tries to befriend a family and even sort of kind of quietly does things for them, like collecting firewood and, all of this stuff. And he's able to befriend the father of this family, the monster is, only because he's blind. And he starts to actually feels what it is to be accepted. And to not have people run away from him frightened. But the rest of the family sees him, they're terrified, and there's this point of rejection that for this monster creates a disconnect, right? Or something snaps in him, and then he goes on this murderous rampage, again, all to get back at his creator for not loving him, essentially, and for creating him to be the way that he is, so that he never experiences happiness. Because do you see how this gets kind of like really deep? Because the monster looks a certain way, right? He is not loved. Boom, that hits on a lot of themes even today, right? What are our standards of beauty? What kind of people do we find acceptable and not acceptable? Who makes us uncomfortable, and who do we push to the edges of society? And essentially, if we want to look at this monster as having all the attributes of anybody who was sort of naturally born, he turns into basically a psychopath. And that talks, I think, to where, what is the birth of a psychopath? Even in our day-to-day, in today's society, what makes a psychopath be born? So, going along those lines of how is a psychopath created? It comes from hurt. It comes from being shunned. I'm not an expert in this area, but just, theorizing here. So this rejection really obviously has this profound effect on this monster and drives him basically to madness for not being accepted. Talks so much about how we treat one another now and what the effects of that can be. And what does it do to a being to feel unaccepted and unloved? So there's some wild, kind of places you can go with this story. And it just, you know, because I've studied it in such depth, again, I'm just kind of keeping it very generic here for this video. It's not that kind of video. But it kind of, you know, makes me laugh whenever I see representations of Frankenstein around, or people referring that in a cultural sense. And I'm always wondering, you know, do they know where that came from? Do they know about the woman behind all of that, who was making social commentary and probably didn't even realize it? Right? So I think if you guys have any more questions about that, let me know down below. Again, this was just a quick little video, and next I shall move on to vampires. See you then.